I'm Abby Wozniak, and I'm going to be talking tonight. I was told on my way in by someone checking folks at the door that I look like a regular person, and so I hope you're not disappointed. So I'm, in addition to being a regular person, I am also the director of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute here at the Federal Reserve, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the Institute, or the OIGI, both of which we call it, and we almost always try to avoid saying the whole entire name if we can, but I have gotten pretty good at it. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what that institute does, and then I'll be coming to the main topic for tonight, which is how employment relationships have changed in the U.S. over time. So the OIGI is an institute that sits here at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, but it responds to the Federal Reserve System's dual mandate. And I can tell, because some of you went on the tour, that at the very least, the tour folks probably know what the dual mandate is at this point. But the Federal Reserve is charged by Congress to try to accomplish two tasks. And the first is price stability, which we hear quite a lot about, particularly when we hear about inflation in the news. And in the last several years, we've heard about very little inflation. That's part of kind of monitoring that level of price fluctuation and price increases is a big part of the Fed's dual mandate, is to try to make sure that prices are stable and rising, but not rising too fast. That's been a big task at the Fed, and to some extent, I would say over the kind of last 20 or 30 years of Federal Reserve research focus, that's received a lot of attention. And the maximum employment part of the dual mandate is something that's received perhaps a little bit less attention. And so the Institute is in part a response to that, to try to bring into the Federal Reserve System more research and more knowledge and more connections with researchers who really work to answer questions about how the economy is faring for everyone. When we think about maximum employment, sometimes economists have a narrow particular concept in mind where they think about a particular employment rate, but most folks think a bit more broadly and are thinking about a kind of full engagement with the economy and an ability to really kind of complete your maximum kind of participation in that economy to the extent that's best for you. And to some extent, that's a kind of concept that we're working to explore and understand at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And in particular, we are conducting and promoting research, kind of per our mission, to increase the opportunity that folks face and to improve their inclusion and kind of full participation in the economy. So that's a big goal, and the dual mandate is a big and fairly, I think, complicated concept. It's difficult even for experts to know when we've achieved either one of the things in it. So how are we doing this, and how do we kind of go about trying to achieve this mission? The Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute really has kind of three big, really four, I've added a fourth, big areas of activity. And what you see sitting kind of at the middle of what we do is research and institute projects. So our mission is to conduct and promote research towards achieving full employment and full participation for everyone in the economy. That research is really critical to understanding what the next kind of appropriate policy steps in that direction would be. But through our research, we connect in a couple of different ways to our other major activities. So one is conferences, which some of you might have seen or heard about, conferences that we have here, both at the bank generally and specifically through the Institute. In October, so a little bit earlier this fall, we had a major conference on housing, and we sought to kind of get answers to questions about how housing could be expanded in cities. And if we did that, what might the outcomes be that we would expect from that? So that's a question that's on lots of folks' mind, particularly here in Minneapolis. And we were fortunate to have a lot of local interest in that, but also a kind of national perspective on that housing question. We also, in addition to kind of a conference that focuses on a specific question, we are developing a more research-oriented conference where we can bring in experts from really across the world to engage with Federal Reserve researchers and engage with each other and really sharpen our understanding of basically all that we need to know to be kind of fully in the research community around our topic areas. We also have a really active scholars program where we bring in folks to spend time in the bank doing research and engaging with our team. And then we also have a kind of variety of ways in which we reach out to the community. And we're working on, as the Institute expands and grows, really improving that. The way I explain that is this way. So the Federal Reserve is doing a lot of work in developing the Institute to think a lot harder about what it means to achieve full employment and what all of the various policies and ingredients to an extent are that would go into full employment. But if we're doing all of that, we should communicate that back out to the public. The public should know that the Fed is doing this type of work. And so that's a really important part of our community engagement. We also work with community partners to try to understand what our research might mean for them and to also get some guidance on what are pressing questions in the community that research moves slowly, but eventually research will turn towards questions that people want answered. So we have a really active community advisory board that can provide some feedback to us along those directions. So that is a really quick overview of what the Institute is trying to do and what the various kind of activities are that we think are going to allow us to achieve our mission. We really hope that the result is going to be an institute that both promotes and conducts its own research, supporting the dual mandate, but also conveying that research out to the relevant wider communities. And so I'm going to jump into tonight's topic, but I'm happy in the Q&A to also take some time to talk about the Institute or what else might be coming from the Institute and what we're working on. Okay, so I am really excited that so many folks, and I'm going to just take this, so I want to be conscious of your time. I'm excited that so many folks have taken the time to come out tonight to hear about job tenure. So I mentioned that we conduct our own research. That was this box here. And so what you're going to hear about tonight is research that I'm doing. It's actually joint with two other Federal Reserve system economists, both who are at the Board of Governors. And we've been trying to understand more about basically why people transition from one job to another. And really more specifically, what we're trying to understand is why they are doing this less often than they used to. So what I'm showing you here are all you should take from this, for the most part, is that these are a bunch of series or data series that are sloping downward. So hopefully when you look at these lines, more or less, I know there's some difference here, but more or less what's happening with all of these is that they're going down over time, and they're all starting back in 1970. So we have quite a long set of information on each of these things. So what are these? These are just different measures of labor market transitions, something that would require you to make some kind of change if you were a labor market participant, if you were someone who was working or actively seeking work. We have one here that is transitioning from one employer to another. This is a move across a labor market, so a longer distance move. This is a longer distance move. This is a movement from unemployment into employment. And I was reading my labels wrong. This is a movement from employment to unemployment. So all these are just measures of a big change that one might make as a labor market participant. And by and large, with a few exceptions and with a lot of cyclicality, these have all declined since 1980. So This comes from earlier work that I did with these same co-authors. And when we started talking about this work widely, we often would get asked a similar question. And we would get asked this question almost regardless of whether we were talking to economists who had studied these kinds of things for quite a while, or if I was talking to someone on an airplane, or just kind of someone hanging out who was interested in finding out what kind of work I did, families at home for the holiday dinners and stuff like that. Everyone would ask us kind of the same question. We would say, well, we're finding that transitions in the labor market have declined over time. People are making fewer changes. In particular, they're making fewer changes from employer to employer, from a job to a job. And then people would say, well, that doesn't make sense because we know that employment stability has declined over time. They wouldn't necessarily always use those exact words, but they would say, well, that doesn't really kind of coincide well with my sense that somehow jobs are less stable now than they were in the past. So I'm kind of just curious, who shares that sense that jobs are less stable now in the past? Does anyone feel like jobs are more stable than they were in the past? Maybe, okay. We have one. So then let me ask a different question. Does anyone know anybody, and it could be yourself, who is in a job that they thought they would have left a long time ago? Or even they're still there even though they thought they would have moved on. Maybe a little more, maybe. Okay, so we're gonna see how this might all unfold together, right? So there's a sense that this stability has declined over time. And there's really good reason to think that. That goes beyond just like our general personal sense or what we might read in the paper. Absolutely, the service sector has risen as a share of employment. There's much evidence that the service sector has shorter employment relationships and more turnover than other sectors. Union coverage has declined. Union employment is typically associated with a high degree of stability or persistence in staying with a particular employer. Unions actively work to make sure that their workforce stays with that employer. And we know that outsourcing has risen. So firms are taking things that they did in-house and they're contracting with a different firm to do them and maybe moving out entire units. So there's all kinds of actual trends we can point to that would suggest that this might in fact be a kind of sense that has a basis in reality. So this is what we would get asked when we would tell folks about this research. And so it led us to try to resolve this tension, okay? So like I showed you, there's these graphs, there's much other evidence that these types of transitions in the labor market have declined. But at the same time, we're running up against a kind of strongly held perception, and again, based in a lot of factors that we know are happening, the stability has somehow declined. So how could we possibly resolve this? So we were asking ourselves, really, this kind of suggests a particular research question. And the question is, how can mobility between employers be declining while stable long-term employment arrangements are also becoming less common? If mobility between employers is declining, shouldn't that mean that people are just staying with their employer for longer? And that doesn't seem to sit well with folks. So that's a kind of very specific question, and it led us to a little bit more general question, which is just what has happened to tenure for employed workers in the last several decades. And what tenure means here is just the specific amount of time that someone has been with their current employer, okay? So that's something that we refer to quite often in the literature as job tenure, and I'm going to use that phrase a lot throughout here. So we're going to answer that question in 3 parts. And I'm not going to drag you through the previous literature, but let me highlight what those 3 parts are. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about what has happened to long tenure. And then I'm going to tell you about what has happened to short tenure. And I think that's actually this slide, and I'll come back to that in a second. And then I'm going to tell you about how people feel about it, okay? And just so you have in your mind, short tenure is going to be folks who have been on their job, they're with their current employer for 0 to 1 year. Long tenure, we're going to define as folks who've been with their employer for 20 years or more, okay? And a couple important things. We're considering whether you've stayed with your employer over that period or not. You might have changed the job that you do for that employer. That's not actually something we can see in the data. So if I say job, just know that that's a shorter word for employer. And what we're talking about is just staying with that particular employer. That's a thing that we can measure well. And also know that we experimented a bit, particularly with this long tenure measure. And so really anything upwards of 15 years, if you liked a number that's higher, like 25, we could have done that, and we would have found pretty similar stuff. So most of what we're finding is not too sensitive to where we decide to define short and long tenure, okay? So those three parts, which we're going to go through: what's happened to long tenure, what's happened to short tenure, and how do people feel about it. So what I want to be able to tell you, first, again, I'm not going to drag you through all of it. I want to just kind of point out to you that we're not the first folks to try to think about this, okay? And the reason that's important is that I always like to convey to people when I can that economists are not idiots, and we do try to think about these issues that I think resonate with folks, and the data doesn't always tell us a clear story. And so this first part of the slide is just telling you about folks who had this idea in the 1990s, and they went and they tried to look for this in the data, and the data really weren't telling a very clear picture about this. So people have had a sense for quite a while, economists included, that employment stability might not be what it used to be, and it's been hard to see in the data. And so that's the main point I just want you all to kind of understand from what's been going on in the background. I'm going to tell you at the end a bit more about the conclusions, but I think we're going to be able to add, in the form of all of this, quite a bit to what we already know about job tenure. So I think a kind of really gratifying thing about this project is that I think we've been able to clarify what for folks was often a bit of a puzzle in the literature. And I'll show you this because this is really where I think that puzzle begins. So this is what a lot of folks ended up looking at when, like I said, in the 90s, they went and tried to look for evidence of changing job stability. What you see in this graph is a couple of different ways of looking at typical tenure, okay? We have at the top one series that tells us the average tenure from a popular data source called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. That's very important to researchers. We also have in these other two lines the current population survey. The current population survey is the one that the unemployment rate that we hear about every month. The unemployment rate comes from the current population survey. So the blue line is telling you about the average tenure that folks have, and the yellow line is telling you from the current population survey the median tenure that people have. All you need to know is that the PSID people are a little bit different than the whole universe of Americans, and the CPS is a little closer, and that's why these lines aren't exactly the same. And then what you need to know is that the median is going to be smaller than the mean because of those 20-year folks who are out there dragging up the average. But what you really need to take away from this graph is that for the most part, these lines are pretty flat. And they're flat going back to about 1980. So they're pretty flat for a long period of time. And so when folks first started to try to look at, well, what's happened to job tenure, that hadn't been measured very much. So part of their work was really just figuring out, collecting the data to measure this. And they were doing their work in the 1990s, and they'd kind of gotten to this part where, they just saw really not much of anything. And the conclusion was, it doesn't look too much like job stability has changed. I guess everybody's worried about something that's maybe not happening. And that's an oversimplification, but that's a reasonable way to summarize that. So this kind of leaves us with this, again, with this question of, well, first of all, this doesn't really even coincide with the impression that folks have, right? All of you raised your hands in that, yes, I think job stability has gone down. Well, if that were the case, probably by these measures, we'd expect these to be downward sloping lines, and they're not. So right away, already the data are not telling us something that's super consistent with, I would say, what the sense is out there. So what we started to do in this project, and this is really where our new stuff begins, is to look at the entire distribution of tenure. To try to look at not just the average or the median, which is a representation of kind of what's the middle or the typical experience, but to try to look more holistically at the whole spectrum of workers in the workforce based on how much tenure they reported. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the percentage of the workforce that says they have been with their employer for this amount of time by each bucket by bucket. And what you should take from this is that in the 1980s, which we've averaged together here, there were more workers with short tenure, less than a year, than there are basically today. Again, we're averaging these together because the current population survey can give us some kind of noisy pictures around these things. Also, in the 1980s, there were, and this might be a bit of a surprise, fewer workers with 20 or more years of tenure than there are today. Okay. Now, this part should perhaps be a little bit of a surprise. This part, there are fewer workers with short tenure. I'm not sure that folks would have a whole lot that they would expect around that, but we'll kind of come back to that when I tell you about what's happening with short tenure. So the second thing I want to kind of demonstrate is that this is actually even more pronounced when we look since the 1990s, okay? And that's important because this is going to be the best place that we can measure short tenure, okay? And so we think that our 1980s comparison actually maybe underestimates that change in short tenure. Okay, so we're going to see more about that when we come to short tenure. But what I'm going to tell you about to kind of achieve that kind of first piece that I mentioned is this part. We're going to start with this part of the distribution. What has happened to long tenure? First of all, you might be asking yourself, why are we finding that we have more folks with long tenure now than in the past? That doesn't seem to line up with our priors that we raised our hands about. I'm going to tell you actually just right away about these pictures that I think tell the story pretty quickly. You don't need to understand necessarily the regression. I'll kind of walk you through what this means. So how did we get to this fact that we have more folks with long tenure now than in the past? The way we got to that is that it turns out the population is aging. And, oh, I know, did you know that? Yes. And it plays out in that as workers age, more folks will have been with their employer for a long period of time because for a variety of reasons over time, and partly because you just get tired, you end up settling with that employer and not being as likely to change as someone who's younger. So what happens is that once we look within a set of individuals who have a certain type of characteristics, we start to drill down and we see that this rise in long tenure is not happening for everybody. Okay? So the first place we see that is that all we've done here is restrict to men. And when we look just at men, this black line, I've done nothing to adjust it except that I left women out of the analysis. Okay? And now, once we've restricted to just looking at men, this is point by point is compared to its level in 1983. So we see that compared to 1980, just looking at men, we are seeing a decline in long tenure, okay? So the first kind of piece of this is that different things are happening for men and women, and the really big piece is that different things are happening by age group. And so this red line is basically doing the same thing as kind of throwing women out. This red line is adjusting for those age differences that are happening. And when you adjust for those age differences that are happening, in essence, what you're doing is you're looking within age groups. And once we do that, we see a very big decline in long tenure. And so what that's telling us is that, in particular for men, within an age group, there have been dramatic declines in long tenure. let me just show you the numbers we had on that. What you see here is the percent who have 20 or more years of tenure in the 1980s and today. And you see that for men, this has dropped by almost 10 percentage points for each age group. These are the 40s, these are the 50s, and these are the 60s. I do like to emphasize that nevertheless, there are still quite a few men who do have 20 or more years of tenure. So a good approximation of how many people get to 20 years of tenure today is really probably about 1 in 4. But in the past, that was above 1 in 3, okay? So that's a big decline. It's meaningful and important. But rumors of the complete death of the kind of 20 or 30-year career are probably overstated. So those still exist out there. Okay. So let me tell you the kind of last couple of pieces of this. The other things that we talked about that have also been changing over time, I kind of mentioned at the outset. Education to some extent is changing. The race and ethnic composition of the population is changing. That might be important. We throw all of those in. They actually don't account for much of that in that they don't reverse this downtrend that we're seeing. What is a little bit important is manufacturing. And so that's what happens in this green line. In the green line, this kind of says once we've accounted for your industry and looked within industries, that decline isn't quite as bad as when we ignore that part, okay? And so that means that some of this decline is coming from a change in industry composition that's happened throughout the US over this period, but very far from all of it, okay? So there's a great amount of the decline in long tenure that must be coming from something else. And there's so much in this project, so I'm going to jump ahead to the key points. So we tried to figure out what could that other thing be? What else could potentially explain why, in particular for men, we have fewer folks in that long tenure category? And this is where we really go back to basics, because there's 2 ways to get fewer people in a group. Either more of them can get kicked out, or fewer folks are coming in over time, okay? And we really looked at both of those. And this is the analysis for are more folks getting kicked out. So what this is, it's a noisy graph, but it's a graph that says if you had 20 or more years of tenure, how likely were you to move into not being employed over the next month? Okay? So this is just a measure of how many folks are in that 20-year category and they're getting kicked out. Now, if this were explaining the decline in long tenure, we would expect these to be going up over time. That would be telling us that folks get to 20 years of tenure and then they get kicked out in the sense that they move into not being employed, okay? And we're not actually seeing that over time, which for folks who've reached 20 years of tenure is probably good news. You're no more likely to separate and not be employed than folks were in the past who got to 20 years of tenure. What we find instead is that fewer folks are making it into that 20-year category. And how is that happening? Well, what is happening is that over time, fewer folks are making it into any of the bins that then allow you to get to 20 years of tenure. What does that mean? Well, if you're going to get to 20 years of tenure by the time you're in your 50s, that's what this black line is, then you have to have had 10 years of tenure by the time you were in your 40s, okay? And if you don't get to that and you change jobs when you're in your 40s, you're not going to have 20 years of tenure when you're in your 50s, okay? So all along the kind of chain of a worker's career, if they get interrupted at any point, they're less likely to reach that 20-year tenure bin. Okay? And that's that kind of inflow piece. How many people are moving into the 20-year group is a function of how many people made it to the 19-year group so that they'd be eligible to have 20 years of tenure the next year. What we're showing you in this graph is that over time, The share of 55 to 64-year-olds who have 20 years of tenure has declined. I already showed you that. We should be on board with that. But at the same time, what's happened is that the share of those in their 40s, mid-40s to mid-50s, who have 10 years of tenure, that has also declined. And even in your 30s and early 40s, the share of folks with 5 years of tenure has declined. So what this is telling us is that people are not hitting those milestones at the same rate that they were in the past. And that prevents the as large a group from reaching that 20-plus year tenure bin. We are able, in the kind of, I don't have a graph of it today, but we're able to link this to the unemployment rates that folks have experienced along the path of their career. And we find that that is explaining a big chunk of that remaining decline in long tenure, particularly for men. I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A. I'm not going to dive too much into this now. But the story for women is quite different. Women have experienced a rise in long tenure over time. And that's been A, dramatic, and B, it's really not accounted for by any of these other things that are happening in the economy. Okay. So that's our kind of first bucket. What's happened to long tenure? I have the second bucket, which is what's happened to short tenure. And what I'm going to show you here is that this, again, as we saw in those kind of bar graphs that we started out with, this has declined over time. This is a little bit less dramatic than the graphs that we have for long tenure. But what you see if you look at all of these series is that folks with a short amount of tenure are a smaller share of the working population than they were in the past. And kind of one of the flattest of these is having something closer to kind of middle tenure, which is 1 to 3 years of tenure. Folks with the biggest declines have less than a quarter or less than a year of tenure. So we can kind of ignore the dotted lines. These are just here to tell you that we think our best guess is that when this decline in short tenure started, it was probably around the mid-1990s or later, okay? That's ultimately, we think, important because we think it's different than the decline in long tenure because that has a different timing pattern, okay? So since the mid-1990s, we've seen decreases in the share of the workforce that have short tenure. And this is to kind of demonstrate to you that all of those things that seem to be contributing to men having a decline in long tenure, they play no role here, okay? So we're getting no traction really at all from adjusting these declines for different things that we can observe changing in the economy over the same time. So what we take away from this is that this decline in short tenure is, first of all, it has different timing than the decline in long tenure, and it's largely unexplained by observable shifts in the economy. So this brings us to a similar question to the one we asked about long tenure, which is kind of, well, then what's causing this? And again, the way you get kind of fewer people in a group is that folks are kind of moving in at slower rates or moving out at slower rates. And so we try to assess that by thinking more closely about what causes someone to have a short amount of tenure. Now, we're going to kind of transition a little bit in our terminology, and we're going to think of folks who have short tenure as recent hires. Depending on whether you're an employer and how long you've been at your job, you may or may not think that someone who's been on the job for a year is a recent hire. Certainly at the Fed, if you've been here less than a year, it counts. You feel like a recent hire. You're still getting used to everything. We're going to call these folks, even though some of them have been on their job for 9-10 months, recent hires because they're still pretty new. And in particular, we're going to kind of group them with folks who are, have been on their jobs for less than a quarter, so less than 3 months. I think those folks count very much as recent hires. This recent hires category can be in the eye of the beholder, but that's how we're going to define it. So what would cause someone to be a recent hire? They can get to be a recent hire in a couple of ways. You can come in to employment from non-employment. Okay, so that's a movement into employment from not working. Maybe you were unemployed, maybe you just were not employed and you made that transition without moving through unemployment. The other way you can get to be a new hire on a job is that you were hired directly away from another job. And that is what we call an employer to employer or a job to job transition. And if you really like to talk the labor code, we just call these E to E. So an E to E flow is employer to employer. You kind of, this is like Monopoly. You went directly there, you did not pass go, and you immediately moved from one type of employment relationship to another employment relationship. So those are the two ways that you can move into the new employer, the new employee category. You can also move out of it, right? So you had a new job, you've been on it for 4 months, but you separated. It wasn't working out. Maybe you were dismissed. Maybe you decided that you really disliked it. There could be a separation even though that employment relationship was very new. And then the other way you move out of being a new employee is you make it to your 1-year anniversary and you stick around. So you're retained, but you actually move into the next tenure group where we would no longer think of you as a new hire, okay? So that's the way you can either get to move into or move out of that recent hire group. And just kind of much like we did with the long tenure group, we're trying to understand, is it the flows in or the flows out? And is it a particular one that's accounting for most of that change in short tenure? And what we're finding is that a lot of it is loading on this employer to employer transition. That particular type of new employment relationship has become less common over time. So what you see here is by different types, levels of previous tenure on your previous job, what is the rate at which you form a new employment relationship? Perhaps not surprisingly, people who were on their last job for not very long are the most likely to have made an E to E move. There are folks who move from a job that they had for 20 years to a new employment relationship, but not as often. Those folks are more stable. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the dots for those with low tenure and their last job are also more likely to become a new employee in the next kind of time that we observe them. What we didn't necessarily know is how this would look over time. And so what we see over time is that the decline is the largest, and there's a lot of cyclicality happening, and it's interesting to think about what's happening right now, because we are in a tight labor market and things are unusual historically. But generally, the decline over time has been largest and has come from those employer-to-employer transitions that were happening among folks who'd been on their last job for very little time, okay? So what that tells us is that this cycling around of I had a job, I stayed on it for a short amount of time, and now I'm gonna try a new one, that has kind of slowed down, okay? It's those folks whose behavior is really changing, not so much folks who were on their jobs for a long time. And also, in our analysis, not so much folks who are coming into employment from non-employment, okay? That has also not slowed down, which is probably good. But an important piece of the puzzle is trying to understand what's happening with this group. So this is also just to kind of demonstrate to you that there's another piece of the puzzle, and that is rising retention, okay? So we have fewer folks moving into that short tenure category, particularly from other jobs that they held for a shorter amount of time. We also have folks who've been on the job for a short amount of time are being retained by their employer at higher rates. And so that, remember I said the other way you could leave the short tenure category was to move into that next higher tenure bin. And so what's happening, kind of consistent with them not moving on to other jobs, folks who've been at a place for a shorter amount of time are more likely, as we go on over time, to stay with that employer. That's what this graph is plotting, the probability that you stayed with the employer that you had by the level of tenure that you reported, okay? So those are really kind of two sides to the same coin, but they tell us that kind of conditional on starting a new employment relationship, the likelihood that you make it to that 1-year anniversary has gone up over time. And because of that, we now have fewer people in that short tenure category than we had in the past. Okay, so that is the what's happening to short tenure bucket. There were some other things we tried to assess as explanations. Won't go through the details now, but happy to talk about those in Q&A. The last thing I want to talk about is, okay, this is interesting. We have fewer folks who are very new on their jobs, and we have fewer folks, particularly for men, who have very long tenure. How do folks feel about this? What does this mean for people? And this really gets to what are the consequences of this. This is a lot harder to assess. One reason it's harder to assess is that we need to know more about the reasons that these things are happening for us to say if they're good or bad. Is it good that workers are staying with their new jobs longer? Maybe, if they're doing that because they're happy and it's a good fit. But if they feel stuck and they just feel like it's really difficult to find something new, then maybe the fact that they're staying with that employer is not so good. And we really don't know about that. Somewhat similar with long tenure, although I think many people feel that long tenure in and of itself is very good. I think we don't know that for sure. There are good things that go with some jobs that tend to have long tenure, but I don't know if we know that it comes from long tenure per se. But again, you can ask the same kinds of questions. Is this good or bad? And so we tried to assess these in a couple of ways. One thing we did, and I'll show you what it looks like, is that we tried to figure out, well, if people are leaving long tenure, are things that kind of look bad happening to them? Are they moving into non-employment in particular, is what we looked at. That might make us think that this kind of decline in long tenure would have a negative effect on how folks are doing. Another thing we tried to do, and we got really lucky in this, is that we found some data that actually went out and asked workers how they felt about their jobs and how they felt about their job security. And these questions were asked at two very distant points in time, but the exact same survey questions were asked. So we can kind of get a picture of at least what workers say they feel about their jobs. So let me tell you about those two pieces that we pulled together, and then I'm happy to take questions. So what we've pulled together here, and I'll say we're real big fans in our work of not doing too much to the data. So you're really seeing what the data look like. Sometimes folks apply smoothers to make these look smoother, which helps to tell the story a little better, but we kind of tend to put it up more as it is. So what you're seeing here is that first piece that I told you about. If folks are leaving a very long employment position, are they more likely to move into not being employed now than they were in the past? And the answer to this is no, and kind of strikingly no. So this is kind of which folks move from being employed to being unemployed, and this is folks who move from being employed to being not employed. As opposed to unemployed, which means you're officially looking for new work. Non-employed says, I'm not actually looking for work. And what we're seeing here is that for older men, if you leave your employment, you are less likely to become non-employed. And we find this same pattern. Here we're looking at older men only. If we look at older men with high tenure, we see the same pattern. If we look at just all high tenure workers, we see the same pattern. So this is fairly striking. Older, more tenured folks who separate are actually not more likely to be not employed. If anything, they're more likely to be reemployed now than in the past. So again, we're trying to decide, is this good or bad? I don't think we have really enough to say, but I think we have a clue that I think a kind of dire picture of folks separating from their employer after 20 years and not being able to find new work, that does not appear to be the pattern that we're seeing in the data. The kind of last thing I want to point to is what people say when we ask them about how they feel about their job security. And also I'm highlighting here, how do you feel about how likely you are to search for a new job? So again, this is where we got lucky in that these two different surveys decided to ask the exact same question of very similar samples about 3.5 decades apart. So this first column is from the 1970s, and this column, labeled GSS, is from the 2000s. And what you see is that by tenure level, first of all, a couple of things. As you go up in tenure, people are more likely to say their job security is good. But what you also see is that over time, these 3.5 decades apart, if anything, folks say their job security now is better than folks were saying in the past. That's biggest for that short tenure group, which we think is striking because those are the folks for whom the data seem to be saying you are less likely to separate than you were in the past. That's why there's fewer short tenure workers. You get a job and you stick around and you convert into not short tenure anymore. For other workers, these levels are high and they're kind of flat over time. But again, if you felt that this long tenure phenomenon was going away and it just gets risky as you get kind of farther in your career, we would expect to see these folks maybe saying less often that they think their own job security is good. So it's striking to us that, again, 3.5 decades apart, people with high tenure feel just about as secure in their job now as they did in the past. There are fewer of them, but they don't feel less secure than folks who had that same level of tenure in the past. That picture kind of carries through some of these other measures of job security. How easy is it to find an equivalent job? How satisfied are you with your job? Again, we think this is pretty important. People are fairly satisfied with their jobs. That hasn't changed much over these 3.5 decades. What has changed a bit, and again, we don't have enough information to say for sure what this means, is people say that it's much more likely that they would search for a job in the next year. And they say that across tenure bins. One possibility could just be that it's a lot cheaper to search for a job now than it was in the past. I can open up Indeed or whatever your engine of choice is, and I've kind of functionally started a job search. Was that harder in the past? I don't know. I'm a big fan of paper newspapers. You could always open up the jobs listings in your paper newspaper 3.5 decades ago, and functionally you're doing exactly what I would be doing if I was looking at Indeed. So I'm not sure why these are going up, but we think it's a useful piece of information to consider and think that's a good place for more research. So let me just kind of conclude with, I think, the big things that we've shown. First of all, the general trend in average tenure is that there is no trend. The kind of central measures of how long people have been with their employer have been very stable over time. Indeed, that created a bit of a puzzle for the earlier literature on this. But when we look at that whole distribution, we find some important changes, particularly in the tails. At the short end, we have fewer workers with very short tenures, and at the long end, we also have fewer workers with long tenure. That leads to that overall stability in the average, but it means that there's important things going on that we weren't observing when we were looking at that average. Women are experiencing a trend in long tenure that's very different from that of men. And in our view, though, the trends roughly are consistent with this declining job-to-job mobility. That's that, decline in the short tenure end. But that long tenure piece is fairly consistent with people's concerns about declines in lifetime jobs. And maybe that is kind of where some of this concern about stability is coming from. We've thought a little bit about the explanations and the consequences, and I talked through a number of those with you. This kind of explanations and consequences gets to be complicated and a little bit harder to think about, but we think it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. One, whatever is driving the change in short tenure is probably different from whatever's happening with long tenure. These are not two sides of the same coin. These are, in our view, likely two different phenomena that happen to be kind of happening not exactly over the same time period, but in a way that kind of masks that, makes that stability show up in the average measures. And then the last is to kind of emphasize that before we can really say more about the consequences of this, we need to know more about why these declines are happening. And the best clue that we have in this direction is just kind of some of these worker self-reports that suggest, not a lot of rising concern about their own work on the part of workers who have them, but that's pretty limited, and that's something we'd like to know more about. So with that, I'm happy to take questions if folks have them, either about this or about the Institute, or possibly other topics if they're of interest. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's really fascinating. Could you talk about what it is the study is trying to expose, and recognizing that you're not really coming into any stability conclusions or whatever? Is tenure the study that maybe now doesn't reveal what it is you're trying to expose?
So, yes and no, I would say. So, first of all, I think that tenure is a reasonable measure of, it's a fair measure of some kind of stability. And I think that it's important to kind of keep in mind that there might be other types of stability that are relevant to people. And so part of what we might be missing is that these other dimensions of stability might have changed over time, even if your spell with your employer did not change. So for example, if your job tasks get changed around a lot, you might stay with your employer, but you might somehow feel less secure because you're kind of frequently having to retrain or learn a new skill, or you just feel that maybe it's not obvious what your employer wants you to be doing. So that kind of deeper measure of job tasks is not something that we can assess in this study. But I think for many folks, this kind of transition from one employer to another is a major transition. And I would say that when we get surprise from people, it's because people feel like that is something that should be changing frequently. People say employment relationships, it's just less stable than it was over time. So I think we've captured that. But I do think there are these deeper other measures of stability that people might have in mind when they kind of express concern about stability. A kind of related point is this, the kind of why, right? And why jobs and employment relationships are stable is really important. Kind of like I mentioned at the beginning, if you stay with your employer because it's a good fit and you really like it, that's great. If you stay with your employer because you feel like you're stuck and there's no other option out there for you, though you don't like it and it's not a good fit, that could lead folks to feel insecure anyway, even though that employment relationship is not going anywhere. So those are just kind of some deeper measures of that relationship and stability that we don't really have access to. Yeah.
Thank you, Abigail. So I follow what you're saying. You're saying factually your survey has indicated stability and tenure. But at the start of your presentation, you polled the room and everyone said, no, that's not what we think. And anecdotally, in the media, I read the same thing. So I'm trying to figure out, why is it so different?
Yeah. So next time you read that in the media, see if they have a source, because I have seen it in the media too, and then I don't see a source. So part of it is that there's been a lot of reporting on this without a study to back it up. Just enough people have said it that now we repeat it. But what I would point to is that I don't think it's completely wrong that folks have this sense. I think, sorry to flip through the slides like this, but I think that for folks, many of whom are men, experiencing this decline in long tenure, that is a form of instability that I think people recognize. They recognize that they are 52 and they've only been with their employer for 8 years. And they're probably not going to make it to 20 years. They may not have, and this kind of gets to a second thing. So a first thing is, that gets reported without a lot of sources. A second thing is, it's not completely wrong because there's a big swath of the population experiencing these declines, even if it's not everybody. But a third thing is, I think sometimes these responses or senses are also reflecting overall kind of financial security. And we don't have I don't have a really good way to assess that. But overall financial security might feel kind of much less stable than in the past, even if your employment itself isn't less stable. So let me just highlight one other kind of graph, because this is, again, sorry to flip through these, but when you ask people, I didn't talk about this one, this is a really consistent question that we have in a big survey of attitudes called the General Social Survey that gets asked every other year. And they've been asking questions since the 1970s, and some of them they've asked repeatedly. So we really have a long time window where we can see these. This question, they just put to folks and they say, how likely do you think it is that you're going to lose your job in the next 12 months? And we've been asking folks this exact same question since the 70s. And these are folks by age group. We've done the same thing by tenure, right, which is not necessarily perfectly lined up with age, but could be related to age. You get the same thing. And what you're getting is that there really isn't a clear trend in this. So in this very large survey of attitudes, people don't say that they feel like it's more likely that their job will end in the next 12 months. The one exception here is a spike in the Great Recession for the youngest workers. And they were right. But they weren't as right as they thought they were. Not 30% of them became unemployed, but they were correct that their job was less stable. And this is not actually something that the GSS produces very often. So when you hear things like, so another thing that I'm interested in, and I've graphed in the GSS, is trust. So trust in institutions. So we've heard that trust in institutions have declined. We heard that. That is true. If you've heard that, that is true. That is true in this survey. If you plot, the response to the question, how much do you trust Congress? It looks like that. And so the GSS has definitely people change their minds. Gender attitudes in the GSS have changed a lot over this same time period. So it's not just that the GSS is mushy and doesn't tell us what people are thinking. It just appears that when you ask a representative sample of people, how likely do they feel they are to lose their job, there's a lot of fluctuation, probably with the economy. Some of this is with the business cycle, but there actually isn't really a trend. And so potentially folks feel like their job won't end, but there might be other kind of deeper things about that. Maybe they kind of wish it would end, and they could get something else. And that's kind of where that unease is coming from. But I think to try to do something about that, we need to really understand what the problem is. And I think what the study is telling us is that it's not the case that these separations are happening a lot more than they were in the past. So we need to start looking elsewhere. Yeah.
Abigail, you mentioned at the beginning that the Institute achieves its mission through research projects. When you say research projects, what type of specific research projects are you talking about, and are they open to the public?
So that's a good question. So in a sense, this project is one, and it's open in that I'm sharing it. We are working on developing a couple of things that will communicate our research to the public better. So we're actually very much with the folks who organize these events working to create a magazine that will be available online and probably here at the bank a bit in paper copy that summarizes Institute research in an accessible way. So shorter, easier to follow summaries. We're also going to kind of put those out more regularly. The projects, the kind of actual analysis is typically done by economists here or potentially with partners throughout the system or other areas in academia. So that's kind of how the research is taking place. We do have an exciting project, which some of you might have read about, where some folks here affiliated with the Institute are partnering with the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul to help evaluate the $15 minimum wage increase and to try to figure out what happens as a result of that in our local economy. So we do, in some cases, have community partners or partners in local government where we can actually benefit from their expertise and the information they have in doing a study. So hopefully that makes sense in that we very much hope to be sharing this information more widely and then partnering with community folks when we can.
What do we know about marginally attached workers? Because looking at the later slides, we noticed it looked like there was a different trend between people moving from unemployed to employed, as opposed to people who were not even possibly considering themselves to be unemployed just before. What do we know about people who claim this? Is it a demographic story? Is it a non-compete clause story? Is it a seasonal work story? What do we know about this?
Yeah, so our read of our data is that a lot of the kind of change at the short end of, in our context, the change at the short end of tenure is coming from less kind of movement within the group of the employed. They had a job last period and they left it for a new one in a short amount of time. And that's where the action is within that group of the employed. And we don't find a big role for folks who were not employed. I'll just do this for a second. This gets into a little bit of some of the data technicalities. There is a completely different way of looking at this, which is to use all of the data in our paper come from surveying people. And in our case, we're looking at workers, people who are employed. So we have what we call a worker level perspective. There's another data source that's kind of used in some of these studies, particularly on that short end, that is really a job or an employer level data set. And authors in that literature kind of point to maybe fewer folks moving from not employed into employment. We're really talking about kind of different concepts, and right now there's not a mapping between a job or an employer level kind of perspective and this worker level perspective. Just to give you a sense of that, in our data, when we look at workers who have 1 quarter of tenure, by the time they get to the next, like basically 80% of them, so 4 out of 5, will reach the next quarter of tenure. So they'll go from being a 1 quarter worker to a 2 quarter worker with that employer. The job level data they call jobs either 1 quarter jobs or 2 quarter jobs. And so we already know that mapping can't be very good because most 1 quarter workers become 2 quarter workers. But that's not the case with 1 quarter jobs. So this is to say that I think this kind of like area of moving from not employed into employed, there's a lot more work to do. And I think the frontier is digging into these administrative data sets where we can really get a good look at that and doing a solid job with that. Yeah.
Mine is more of a comment. I'm intrigued with the tenure and the 20 years. My generation, and I wasn't part of it because I didn't stay for the gold watch syndrome, but you probably all have heard the gold watch syndrome, where folks get out of college and they retire from that same company after 30, 40, 45 years. So I mean, I feel that, of course, that whole generation or that whole concept is gone. But are you even entering any of that kind of consideration of what the past was and how this may have some implications for this 20 plus years that you're looking at?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting group, and it's not this even longer. I won't flip back to the bar chart. The groups who have even more tenure than 20 years, so like folks who reach 30, 35, 40 years, we should kind of figure out how big a share they are. Because I think it's possible that some concern for folks comes, perhaps those folks are important in a way that our analysis right now doesn't account for, right? So if you see someone at your company who's been there 40 years, that's exactly this kind of lifetime job you're talking about. And 20 years isn't really a lifetime job. It's long, but it's not a lifetime job. And I haven't seen a study, and we haven't done it, where folks really try to look at that lifetime group. I think they're an interesting group. I suspect we're going to see a kind of similar picture because of that, basically that process I described of to get to 20 years, you have to have gotten to 10 years. To get to 10 years, you have to have gotten to 5 years. And we do see that's all of those stages along the way are becoming less common, hitting those milestones. So I don't know that it would change the picture a lot, but it'd be interesting to know more about that group. Yeah.
Yeah, I had an observation here, and then I had a few questions here. But I noticed I checked my Fred app on my phone when we were talking, and during this period from 1980 to 2019, real GDP has increased about three times what it was over that period. So the economy has been very productive, I would say, in that period. And I was wondering, did you try to separate this data between the public and the private sectors at all?
Yeah.
And the change in the relative size of the sectors over the period of time?
We didn't. We did not look at the relative size. So so a couple of things. In the graphs that I showed you where we adjusted for different things, one of the things we adjusted for is which sector you were working in. And that takes into account basically that the economy has shifted from manufacturing into services. So that's accounted for. I cut them from the presentation because I already knew I had way too much stuff, but we did have tables by industry. And what you see is that the public sector is a big exception to basically to all of this. So the public sector is one sector where it is not the case that long tenure has declined. So if you're a public sector employee, you've been somehow insulated from a lot of this.
Was there increased mobility in the private sector with the kind of the change from pension plans into 401k plans?
So that's one we tried to look into. There is just simply not a lot of evidence on that. It's possible. The idea, I think, would be that since you are not getting a pension at your particular employer, you can just port your 401k with you, and so then there should be more mobility. There's not a lot of evidence we can bring to bear on that. The data sources we're using don't measure whether people have pensions or 401ks, not routinely. Again, I would come back to that kind of process of hitting the milestones. So again, 5-year workers, they're not very close to their pension. We still see people not hitting that 5-year milestone. So it's something happening. You're sticking around at the beginning, but then movement starts happening, and that's breaking up that path to 20 years.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is I graduated from college in 1970s, and there weren't a whole lot of jobs available then. But over the long run, things have turned out well. So if the millennials are bummed out with 2008, I think they've got nothing but a really bright future ahead of them.
I think there's certainly stability out there to be had. In other work, some that I've done and some that others have gone on and done really great jobs with in the years since I did this, what we unfortunately find is that when you start in a downturn, folks don't make up those earnings. They catch up on an hourly basis, but you've kind of missed out on having that higher paying job for those years, and that part doesn't get made up. So that part, that is water under the bridge. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that for millennials. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Abby. I really enjoyed your talk. I guess I have a lot of questions, so I'll try to just pick one. Could you maybe boil this down to a big takeaway for us? So what's the most important thing that we should know for business or workers? And is there something specific that's relevant for Minnesota? Are we sort of on par with the national averages here?
Yeah. So I think I don't have any state-specific information. That would be interesting to know. So I'll have to leave that aside, but that's an interesting thing to drill down on. One big takeaway. I think a fair takeaway. I always really have 3 takeaways, so I'll try to boil it down to one. Is that I think stability is the sense that stability is not as good as it used to be is probably not unfounded, but it also is probably not playing out the way people think that it is. Certainly, we have in many sectors and for many people in our workforce, we have at least as much stability measured as staying with your employer as we did in the past. That's not uniformly across the board, but I think it's much more extensive than folks appreciate. And that's not to say that there aren't ways that the economy can work better for people, but it is to say that a concern that everything is topsy-turvy and people are turning over left and right, and you have no idea when your job might end, that seems to be not borne out in the data. So I think the sense folks have is right and is probably coming from somewhere. It might be coming from a kind of large amount of attention for the parts of the economy that have seen declines in long tenure. But it's important to keep in mind that that's not the overall story. Maybe
we've got time for just 2 more questions. We're going to take one over here and one over here.
Okay, thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk here, and I had lots of questions, but I just want to ask one. I was wondering about the generational impact, for example, that the baby boomers were such a huge chunk that did that distort. For example, I noticed that when people seemed to be settling down, that was just as boomers were hitting the settling down age. And then, of course, we were followed by some smaller generations, our children, the millennials, are going to outnumber us shortly, which fine by me. Anyway, so I was wondering if you looked at kind of that generational thing, because when I look at these, what is happening to 60-year-olds or whatever, or the 25 to 34, they're not the same people in the different years.
Right.
And some of them were a much bigger cohort than others.
Yeah. We haven't adjusted for cohort size. It's hard. Something that is just always hard in this kind of research of trends over time is that we have cohorts that are different, and they're different ages at different times. And then we also have things changing over time, right? So the boomers experienced a particular profile of unemployment ups and downs over their careers, and later generations experienced a different profile. And we attribute the changes that we see in large part to that unemployment ups and downs. Could it be that there were kind of more fundamental generational differences that go along with that? Maybe, but that's not something we've been able to parse out. There are I would say there are researchers doing work in this area of turnover, and sometimes it's called dynamism, who are looking more at a role for generational size and the aging of the population. In our work, it doesn't show up a lot. We think there's maybe some more fundamental changes that have happened that our research is kind of suggesting that, but I wouldn't rule it out entirely. Yeah, but I would say our analysis right now, we're kind of pinning it more on those different experiences with unemployment that we can measure than we are on something about the cohort per se. Yeah.
This is great. I love to see this research about what it isn't, and I think that that's very clearly coming through.
Thank you. Are you a journal editor? No, no one gets that.
Then,
what is it?
Keeping it kind of optimistic, then, is what is the next? Because I think you've answered what it isn't, and I think that's sort of reassuring, and even make the people know. But also, what is in terms of next steps for the research, and especially because it does seem to be perceptions around something else that might be causing this sort of feeling of instability.
Yeah. So I think questions of financial stability are really interesting. For me, that would be a big investment in a somewhat new toolkit. So I kind of hope that researchers who are better positioned to do that will pick up the ball and run with it. But who knows? 4 years from now, I might be standing here telling folks about what's happened with financial stability. I think there are really interesting questions as to just kind of how financial needs have shaped people's feelings about their current employment. I'm not even sure economists are the right people to solely answer this. I think we certainly have something to say about it, but I think there's a big role for other social science disciplines to kind of try to weigh in on what is the relationship that folks have to work now, and has that changed over time? I think other disciplines have a lot to say about that. But I think we'll need a better handle on kind of the financial situation people are in. We don't know a lot about what they forecast for themselves, right? So I think some instability that folks feel is related to kind of a great uncertainty about the potentially long years after employment. And yeah, so I think all that's to say, maybe I will invest in those tools to kind of go down that path. These are kind of the tools that I have, and I think we've explored the territory in a pretty thorough way. That's an exciting thing about research, though. It actually, I'm very happy when someone kind of picks up on a thread and then does something awesome with it. That would be great. So I enjoy being part of the research process because I enjoy the fact that it works as a community. Not everyone can answer all the questions. And so I think this is probably bigger than something I'm going to be able to just, put a big, solved condition at the end of. So we'll see. We'll see what comes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Abby.